The first food bank in Canada opened in 1981 in Edmonton to address emergency food insecurity. Today, more than 850,000 people each month seek food assistance from one of the hundreds of food banks across the country. And increasingly, they're seeking out other kinds of assistance there too. Carolyn Stewart is the Manager of Operations and Policy for the Ontario Association of Food Banks, and she joins us now for more on the range of services that food banks are being called upon to provide to people today. Carolyn, great to meet you here on TVO tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
First time on television, and we're glad you're spending it here with us.
Thank you.
That's great. Here is, here's the latest Hunger Report, Hunger Report 2015, and I want to read an excerpt from that to get us started here. The Ontario Association of Food Banks is a collaborative network of 125 direct member food banks and over 1,100 affiliate hunger relief programs and agencies across the province, you tell us. This includes breakfast clubs, school meal programs, community food centers, food pantries, community kitchens, emergency shelters, and senior centers. Your association distributes 7 million pounds of fresh and non-perishable food, including fresh milk, eggs, meat, and produce. How many people, I know we said 850,000 across the country, how many people are using your services here in the province of Ontario alone?
In Ontario, there are 360,000 people who visit food banks every single month. That's down slightly from 2014, which was at 375,000 people. But that largely just reflects the ebb and flow of food bank use in the province. So it's extreme. It's a lot more people than anyone would ever think.
It's a big city.
It's a big city, yeah. It's the size what we've took, like the whole city of London, Ontario, visiting a food bank every single month. And it's definitely not who you'd think it is. It's children, 121,000 children every single month. There's seniors, post-secondary students, the employed, everyone that you could ever imagine visits a food bank.
You did mention that 15,000 fewer people are actually using the food banks in Ontario. These are March 2015 over March 2014 numbers, correct. I guess the last year for which numbers are available. But that there were 10,000 more visits to food banks.
Yes.
So explain that to us.
So you'd have to look at the difference between unique individuals and number of visits. The number of unique individuals visiting a food bank is the number of people or unique persons who are visiting a food bank every month. Those people may visit a food bank more than one time per month if that's needed. So when in fact there are fewer people visiting, the need actually grew because those individuals needed to visit more frequently.
As we pointed out, food banks have been around for 3.5 decades now.
Yes.
Do you think there's still stigma attached to going to a food bank to get food?
I think stigmas are fed by misunderstandings. So I think from the public's perception, it's just a misunderstanding of who it is that visits food banks. When you think about a child or the 121,000 children who visit food banks, it's hard to attach a stigma to a child.
Can I jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
Do kids actually show up?
Yes. Definitely.
So
they would come with their parents. There's numerous children's programs that exist at food banks. Breakfast clubs, back to school programs. There's toy programs, birthday clubs, all sorts of different things that are accessible also for children.
But besides the programs, do kids actually show up to go box food and take food home for what they need?
So it depends on the food bank. So some food banks have a shopping model where they're actually able to visit and grocery shop like they would in a regular grocery store and choose what's best for their family. So a child would come with a parent. Alternately, depending on the food bank, they may create a hamper that's meant for a single individual, a family with children, a family without children. And so the child may just accompany a parent into a food bank when they need assistance.
How do you destigmatize food banks for those people who still want to stigmatize those who go?
That's one of our biggest challenges at the OAFB. We think public education is key. When people have misconceptions about who it is that visits food banks, that feeds into that stigma. So we think promoting in the 2015 Hunger Report is one vehicle that we use, but to promote what food banks do to demonstrate that they don't just provide the antiquated sense of what people kind of envision about food banks, but rather they provide emergency food support, but they also do resume building workshops, they do job skills training, they do dental care clinics or child care on occasion. So all sorts of different programs that are far beyond the very basic idea of emergency food support.
Once again, I'm going to quote from the report here. Food banks across Ontario have grown beyond the traditional idea of a non-perishable food cupboard. Recognizing hunger as a symptom of poverty, food banks provide emergency food support in addition to programs and services that assist those living with financial insecurity. Let's get into that. I know you made a bit of a list there, but the non-perishable food services that food banks offer.
Yes.
Give us a bit more of a list and how recent that phenomenon is of food banks being more than just the place that you show up to get food.
Yeah, I don't think it's, to be honest, a very recent phenomenon. I think food banks have just realized that they need to actually begin publicizing it and advertising what they actually do, in the sense that to make sure that people understand what services they provide, to once again destigmatize visiting there. So if someone needs assistance, there is no stigma attached to visiting, but also to demonstrate that there's a community service that provides not just emergency food support, but all sorts of assistance that can help people lift themselves out of poverty. So whether it is, an accredited cooking program that exists at our food bank in Windsor, or a dental clinic, or a resume writing
Now,
workshop.
That's interesting. Who thinks of going to a food bank to learn how to brush up on your resume writing skills?
In a lot of occasions, food banks are kind of the front line. So people have that immediate need of food support. So they'll visit for that initial assistance, and then realize that there's a bunch of other services that exist that can assist them in one location.
Valerie Terrace, actually, before we went on the air, you pointed out that you watched our program recently on food insecurity, where we had a number of people on, including Valerie Terasuk from the University of Toronto, who came on to discuss it. And we want to pull a little clip from that discussion, which you can watch up there on that monitor, and then we'll come back and chat.
Great.
Roll it, please, Sheldon.
A few years ago, we did an extensive study looking at people who used food banks in Toronto, and we couldn't see any effect of the use of the food bank on those people's dietary intakes. Why not? Because it was literally a drop in the bucket. Because food banks are donor-driven, voluntary organizations, their operation effectively boils down to rationing what they've received in terms of donations.
Okay, I don't want to make trouble between you two. However, food banks have been around, as we said, for 3.5 decades. Food insecurity appears to be worse now than it was then.
Yes.
So how accurate is her characterization?
I don't think it's accurate at all, particularly when it comes to the food banks that I represent in Ontario. Ontario's food banks do so much more, as we've already talked about, and then just provide emergency food support. But when it comes to specifically the emergency food support, they provide balanced hampers. So they provide fresh meat, fresh eggs, dairy, as well as the non-perishables and all sorts of different products. But they're that accessibility point for individuals who may not be able to make it to the end of the month because they've had to choose between rent and food, hydro and food, taking transit to work and food. So when people are left with very limited options, it's lucky that there's food banks around to be able to provide that sort of assistance, particularly now when the focus has been on increasing the amount of fresh food in food banks. For example, the OAFB in the last 2 years has actually provided more fresh and frozen foods than non-perishable. And we've been able to create 5 new agricultural programs with Ontario's producer groups. So eggs, dairy, chicken, pork, beef, sheep have all actually assisted in providing the food banks with fresh meat straight from the farm that's available in grocery stores direct to food bank clients. So I think it's actually increasing the accessibility of foods to clients to let them get back on their feet.
She did describe it as a drop in the bucket, though, compared to the need. Is that accurate?
I don't believe so. Food banks provide anywhere from 3 days worth of food to 11 days worth of food. So when that's up, in some cases, a third of the month, I don't think you can see that as a drop in the bucket. These individuals need assistance, and without it, where would they be?
I think most people's understanding of food banks is there are probably more of them in the big cities of the South. If you live north of the French River, what's the food bank situation like in Northern Ontario?
It reflects, I guess if you're looking at rural communities versus urban communities, rural communities see more working individuals. They see more 2-parent families, more homeowners. So those are in communities about 10,000 people or less. So, but that being said, they also experience things like accessibility issues. So if you're, 30, 40, 50 miles from the closest grocery store, your accessibility to food is limited. So frequently, if the grocery store is not open, because you happen to be working when it is open, you have to rely on other convenience locations to be able to access food, which can be very limiting.
Like I have no idea, so I'm
Yeah.
looking to you for information here. But I mean, is there a food bank in Timmins? Is there one in Moosonee? Is there one in Hearst? Is there one in the Sioux?
There's one in Hearst, there's one in Timmins,
Really?
there's one in
Okay.
Cochrane, there's one, our member in Thunder Bay services all of northwestern Ontario, so an area the size of France.
Oh my gosh.
So you can imagine, and they have a staff of 4 people. So they do incredible work all across northwestern Ontario and serve isolated communities that are only accessible via ice road or fly-in communities, which is you know, a whole other isolated problem in northern Ontario that food insecurity needs to deal with.
There's an article on the new face of hunger in the National Geographic magazine, and it makes this claim. Most of the working poor don't have the time or know-how required to eat well on little. What do you think of that observation?
I think food literacy is something that's actually lacking in the general public, so not something necessarily for people with limited income. What I think it actually reflects in low-income individuals is they have less choice. So when you have a limited budget and you have to purchase food, you're going to purchase the most you can for your dollar. So usually that includes convenience foods, high calorie,
That's
low
so
nutritional
nice of you.
dense.
You're calling it convenience foods. I think what you mean to say is junk food, don't you?
Not necessarily,
No?
perhaps processed or prepared food.
Okay.
So it depends on what it is, because you know, it can vary. But ultimately, people with low income have less accessibility, or you know, if you live in a rooming house and you may only have access to a hot plate and a microwave, it makes it incredibly challenging for you to cook to begin with. So there's a lot of reasons that I think impact an individual's food literacy and cooking abilities, which may not be the actual inability to cook, but rather the challenges that exist in accessing food.
Let's talk about the people who give.
Yes.
The food that they give, in the main, is that the food that you actually need?
Usually most food banks have now kind of have a list of what they need most in their community. So they've worked with their community to advertise. So local constituents will donate that. We always suggest donate what you would purchase for your own home, because that's usually what someone else would also like. So most of the time, if there's donations in one area, then food banks may actually purchase in another area that might be lacking to try to balance out donations.
Because the one thing you hear all the time is non-perishable, obviously, canned goods.
Yes.
But do you want people to give beyond that?
Definitely. So there's 2 options. One, food banks do accept fresh food. So it's something to keep in mind. If you're dropping food off at the food bank, you can donate fresh eggs, fresh meat, fresh vegetables. They'll gladly accept that. Alternately, you can also make monetary donations. For every $1 donated, we're actually able to acquire the equivalent of $8 worth of food or 3 meals. So $1 goes a very, very long way in making an impact.
How do you figure that?
When you measure out how much food we can actually acquire via donations and working collectively as a network, you can actually acquire more with less.
I don't have to tell you, Toronto, some parts of Toronto are incredibly rich. Some
Yes.
parts are not.
Yes.
Here in the capital city. And, you know, there are events every night of the week in this big city where the amount of food being thrown away because people don't eat it
Yes.
is astonishing.
Yes.
Do you have links to kind of do anything with that food?
So the OAFB deals directly in kind of retail size food bank packaging. There's meal programs or missions or shelters that deal directly with that sort of programming. There's also limitations depending on whether it's been served or not served. Unfortunately, the government limits for
sure.
food safety purposes. But there are organizations that deal directly with that, and I would look into working with a meal program because they could use that product directly that day.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's finish up on this. Carolyn, there's sort of 2 schools of thought about this.
Yes.
One is that it is a tragedy that a country like Canada, with the resources and the wealth that we have, still have food banks 3.5 decades later.
Yes.
That's one point of view. There's another point of view that says poverty has always been with us, it always will be with us, and it's a good thing that food banks are there to fill the gap. Which do you think is more accurate?
Can I say a mixture of both?
You can say whatever you like.
I think food banks don't want to be in business. I think they would ultimately love for everyone to have a standard quality of life that's, reflective of Canada as a country. That being said, until such time that can exist, I think food banks are happy to be here to help those in need, and great strides can be done to alleviate poverty.
Gotcha. That's Carolyn Stewart, Manager of Operations and Policy for the Ontario Association of Food Banks. Thanks so much, Carolyn, for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.